Hi, thanks, Gwen. Hello,
Hi,
everyone. I'm really honored the panelists that I'm sharing this platform with. It's fantastic listening to your stories, to be sitting up here with you. I live in New York in the United States of America, and I have a master's degree in humanistic and multicultural education. I taught secondary English education for 13 years before kind of accidentally becoming a business consultant, which is part of the story that I'll share. I have a certificate from Harvard, the Harvard Online for organizational leadership, and I'm an accredited cross cultural consultant. So, teaching really is the theme that runs through most of what I do. And my main focus right now in my professional endeavors is I'm a change catalyst. So, I go in and I work with individuals and organizations to help adapt and initiate change so that they can improve their performance and well being. And this is both in their personal and professional lives, so they can be more effective in their communities, more effective with their families. And the interesting thing is that for me, change was this thing that I always had like a love hate relationship with. I had a challenging upbringing, I had some difficult marriages. And so when you're in those situations, what you want is change. And at the same time, when you're in those situations, because there's so much that's out of your control, you don't like change because it's one more thing that you're not in charge of. So the fact that I always struggled with it is what's made me so passionate about it. And when I had the life circumstances that drove me into being a business consultant, I found the connection between the education, the struggles that I had had in my life, and this opportunity to really go in and help people to take action where they need to, and also figure out a plan when change throws itself upon them. So I know that you had question and answer period. I want to make sure that I give opportunity for everybody to share equally. So I can share more now, or I didn't know if you wanted to move into the questions and answers. Just want to make sure that everybody's
you
got time.
can finish up about
Okay.
yourself,
Okay.
and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A session. We've got some very interesting questions already in the chat.
Great. Great. So I think if I kind of hone in on something that I think would be helpful for folks to hear, right? So my childhood, I was raised in a household with two alcoholic parents. There was abuse. And while I didn't then become an alcoholic myself, which is unfortunately sometimes the course that a lot of individuals go through, I definitely internalized the messages that I went through in terms of my self worth and carried that forward. I was in an abusive marriage. When that marriage ended, I thought, okay, now I know I've got my bearings, not going to let this happen again. And then ended up in a second unhealthy marriage with my children's father, a different type of abuse, but abuse nonetheless. And when that marriage ended, I had predominantly stepped back a lot from my teaching career. I had gone part time because my first child was born with special needs, and I was a lot of attention that was needed there. So I found myself now I'm a single parent, had really stepped away from my career and was like, what am I going to do at this point? And a friend of mine said, why don't you come work for, I've one of the clients I'm working with that could really use some help editing their website. So I thought, okay, well, I've got my English background. I'll go ahead and do that. And in that opportunity, the CEO of the company I would be suggesting things said, I'm not sure why we're only using you for copywriting. We could probably have you do some other things. And as such, I ended up becoming a business consultant, which had never been part of my life plan, and really truly love it. And in that opportunity to be in organizations, try to empower and motivate people. And I find myself in a lot of the conversations where, particularly in regards to today and this topic, women in leadership positions who are being invited to the table, but they're not being heard at the table. And sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it's not subtle. Somebody will say something. People will nod. Okay, that's I hear you. And then a male counterpart will say relatively the exact same thing, and people, oh, that's a great idea. Like that's really such a fantastic idea. And how do you maneuver through that? Because I think there's a reluctance to make it sound like you're feeling that you're not being treated fairly, because then people think, well, like, what do you mean I'm not treating you fairly? So having to kind of encourage women to have their voices be heard without that impression that we know that can happen of, you are at the table, you're here, we're nodding, we're listening to you, but they're not truly being heard. So that's become a real passion of mine. And I think putting that together with encouraging people to advocate on their own behalf in relationships, teaching our young girls about what is and isn't okay and what to expect. and how they can go into the workforce and understand what is okay to ask for. I still, to this point, I'm 46 years old, right? So I'm not the adolescent teenager that was struggling in an alcoholic household. I'm not the 20-year-old that was in an abusive relationship. And yet at 46, I find myself in rooms with professionals still saying, like, do I belong here? Am I enough? And our reluctance to say that, because I think we have this impression that if we call out our feeling of inferiority or that imposter syndrome, it's going to make people think that we're less than, right? Who's going to have a change consultant come into their business and tell them how to change things if they're not really confident in themselves? And yet sharing that in a forum like this, right, where I'm clearly surrounded by incredible folks on this call, is so powerful for all of us to acknowledge and say, I don't know what I'm doing sometimes. I feel alone. I feel scared. I feel frustrated when I know the change that needs to happen, but don't exactly know how to activate it. And the more that we call out to one another and acknowledge that and have conversations like this, the more that we're going to continue to change and grow. And so for me, a big part of being a panelist today isn't even really just about imparting, excuse me, my experience, but hearing the questions that people have so that I can take away from today and go, okay, what are things I need to make sure that I'm asking when I go into these companies or when I'm talking to individuals? Because ultimately, whether you're a leader in a new position and don't know what to do, or you're a newly single mom who had no idea that was going to be her life plan, there's planning that has to take place. And I don't want to assume that I have all the answers. I want to make sure that I'm surrounding myself with incredible people like the folks on this call who can give me guidance and say, hey, Deb, you may not have thought of this.